In the American imagination during the Second World War, the Japanese enemy was a monolith. He was male, fanatical, indoctrinated with the Bushido Code, a soldier who would fight to the last man and choose death over the dishonor of surrender. Propaganda posters, newsreels, and frontline accounts painted a singular, terrifying portrait. This was the enemy America knew, the one it was prepared to fight. But war is never so simple. Hidden in the margins of this grand, brutal narrative is a story so unexpected, so contrary to the official picture, that it was almost completely erased from history. It is a story not of soldiers, but of nurses, civilians, mothers, and daughters. It is the story of Japanese women captured on the battlefield, deemed prisoners of war, and secretly transported thousands of miles to be held captive in the heart of America. They were a phantom enemy, their existence a classified secret and a logistical anomaly. Who were these women? Why were they brought to the United States when hundreds of thousands of male Japanese POWs were held in camps across the Pacific? This is the story of a journey into the unknown, a clash of cultures behind barbed wire, and the profound silence that followed. It is the story of the Empress's cage and the forgotten women held within. June 15, 1944. The island of Saipan. This was to be a decisive battle in the Pacific War, a critical stepping stone for the American advance toward the Japanese mainland. What the U.S. Marines expected was a bloody, hard-fought battle against entrenched Japanese soldiers. What they found was something far more horrific, something that would sear itself into the American consciousness. Saipan was not just a military fortress, it was home to over 25,000 Japanese civilians, including thousands of women and children, who had been settled there as part of Japan's colonial expansion. As the American invasion swept across the island, Japanese military propaganda, which painted Americans as monstrous rapists and torturers, reached a fever pitch. Cornered, terrified, and fed a narrative of unspeakable atrocities, entire families made a final, desperate choice. From the high cliffs on the island's northern shore, they began to jump. Mothers threw their children into the churning sea before following them. Groups of schoolgirls, encouraged by soldiers, joined hands and leapt to their deaths. American GIs, hardened by combat, watched in helpless horror, their loudspeakers pleading in broken Japanese for the civilians to surrender, to trust them. This mass suicide at Marpai Point, forever known as Bonsai Cliff, cemented the American view of the Japanese as a fanatically loyal, incomprehensible people. But amidst this carnage, some did not jump. Some were captured, and among them, for the first time in large numbers, were women. The GIs who stormed the beaches and fought through the caves and jungles of Saipan were trained to kill or capture enemy soldiers. They were not prepared for what they found in the aftermath of the fighting. Huddled in caves, hiding in sugarcane fields, were not just soldiers, but terrified women clutching infants, dazed teenagers, and elderly civilians. The initial American response was one of profound confusion. The military's own intelligence had grossly underestimated the civilian population. There were no established protocols for handling thousands of non-combatant prisoners, let alone women. The immediate priority was security and basic humanitarian aid. Makeshift internment camps, little more than barbed wire enclosures, were hastily constructed. But a crucial distinction quickly emerged. Most of these civilians were Okinawans or Koreans, forced laborers brought to the island. They were processed and held in separate, sprawling camps. A smaller, more specific group was singled out: Japanese nationals. And within that group, a few dozen women were identified as being of particular interest. They were nurses attached to the Japanese military, civilian employees of the army, or simply women whose status was unclear. They weren't just civilians. They were connected, however loosely, to the enemy's war machine. This presented a legal and logistical problem. What were they? Non-combatants? Or were they something new, something the U.S. military had never had to officially classify before? Female prisoners of war? The decision was made far up the chain of command, in the halls of Washington. While the vast majority of captured Japanese, both military and civilian, would be held in camps in the Pacific, a select few would be sent to the continental United States. The primary reason was intelligence. The war in the Pacific was a brutal slog, and any information about Japanese military capabilities, civilian morale, or industrial capacity was priceless. Interrogating prisoners on the front lines was chaotic and inefficient. A secure, controlled environment, far from the war, was deemed necessary for high-value interrogations. Among the thousands of male prisoners selected for this journey, a small, unprecedented contingent was included, around 150 women. This group was a mix. Military nurses captured on Saipan and the Aleutian island of Attu, and a handful of civilians deemed to have potential intelligence value. For these women, the journey was a terrifying ordeal. Stripped of their identities and possessions, they were herded onto transport ships. They had been raised on stories of the barbarity of their American captors. Every moment was filled with dread. The long, rolling voyage across the vast Pacific, confined to cramped and guarded quarters below deck, was a journey into absolute uncertainty. They were leaving behind a world on fire, heading toward the heartland of the enemy, a country they knew only through the distorted lens of propaganda. They had no idea where they were going, or if they would ever see their homeland again. After weeks at sea, the ships slipped quietly into San Francisco Bay, passing under the iconic, fog-shrouded arc of the Golden Gate Bridge. For the women on board, this symbol of American promise was a gateway to their prison. They were brought to Angel Island, a place with a long, complicated history as an immigration station, often called the Ellis Island of the West. But for these new arrivals, it was a processing center for enemies of the state. Here, the process of becoming a prisoner was formalized. They were photographed, fingerprinted, and subjected to medical examinations that were often bewildering and humiliating. They were issued POW identification numbers and stenciled clothing. Nisei translators, Japanese-American soldiers caught in the bizarre position of interpreting for their ancestral countrymen, tried to bridge the immense linguistic and cultural gap, often with limited success. The women were silent, watchful, and terrified. They were processed alongside German and Italian POWs, and a few high-value Japanese male officers, but they were kept strictly segregated. Angel Island was a way station, a bureaucratic purgatory before the final leg of their journey. From the cold, windswept island, they could see the glittering lights of San Francisco, a city teeming with life, a world away from the war-torn homes they had left. It was a tantalizing and cruel glimpse of a freedom they could not have, a stark reminder of just how far they were from everything they had ever known. From California, the women were put on trains with blacked-out windows for a secretive, multi-day journey across the American continent. Their destination was one of the largest POW camps in the country, Camp McCoy, located deep in the rolling hills of rural Wisconsin. Built to hold thousands of German and Italian prisoners, Camp McCoy was a city unto itself, a sprawling complex of barracks, mess halls, and guard towers. Within this massive camp, a special, small compound had been prepared. Surrounded by its own double row of barbed wire fences and patrolled by dedicated guards, this was to be the home of the Japanese female POWs. The contrast between their new environment and their former lives could not have been more extreme. The lush green fields, the dense northern woods, the cold, crisp air of the American Midwest. It was an alien landscape. The women were housed in standard military barracks, Spartan and cold. Their arrival was a source of immense curiosity and bewilderment for the American soldiers stationed at the camp, most of whom had never seen a Japanese person before, let alone a female prisoner of war. The army took great pains to keep their presence a secret from the public. No press was allowed, and letters were heavily censored. Here, in the heart of America, thousands of miles from the Pacific, a tiny, isolated piece of the Japanese Empire was now confined, waiting to see what its captors had in store. Upon their arrival and during the initial interrogations, American military intelligence operated under a pervasive and damaging assumption. Lacking credible information about the role of women in Japanese society and the military, they turned to rumor and speculation. The prevailing theory among many interrogators was that these women must be comfort women, a euphemism for the tens of thousands of women, mostly Korean and Chinese, who were forced into sexual slavery for the Japanese Imperial Army. This misconception colored their initial treatment and the line of questioning they faced. The women, who were primarily trained nurses and civilian workers, were subjected to invasive and humiliating questions about their relationships with soldiers. For these women, raised in a deeply conservative and patriarchal society where such topics were taboo, the interrogations were a source of profound shame and confusion. They were being accused of something they could not comprehend. While some women captured in the Pacific were indeed comfort women, the specific group brought to Camp McCoy was not. They were military personnel and civilian employees. The failure of American intelligence to make this distinction early on created an atmosphere of mistrust and degradation, adding another layer of psychological trauma to their captivity. It was a fundamental cultural misunderstanding, one that revealed how little America truly understood the enemy it was fighting, and how easily the humanity of these women could be obscured by prejudice and ignorance. While many of the women at Camp McCoy were from Saipan, another distinct group had a very different story. They were the nurses of Attu. In May of 1943, nearly a year before Saipan, American forces landed on the desolate, fog-shrouded island of Attu in the Aleutian Chain, the site of the only land battle of World War II fought on North American soil. The fighting was savage, and the Japanese garrison, knowing they could not win, ultimately staged a massive banzai charge, fighting to the last man. In the aftermath, amidst the nearly 2,400 Japanese dead, American soldiers made a startling discovery in a field hospital: 21 surviving nurses. Led by Chief Nurse Tatsuko Nibu, these women had been tending to the wounded under horrific conditions. Their capture was a complete shock to the U.S. military. Unlike the civilians on Saipan, these were uniformed, non-combatant personnel, clearly covered by the Articles of the Geneva Convention. Their story provided a clearer, more defined narrative than that of the other captives. They were professionals, caught in the maelstrom of war while performing their duties. Their journey to Camp McCoy followed a similar path, but their status as formal military nurses set them apart. They maintained a sense of discipline and hierarchy within the camp, led by the formidable Chief Nibu. Their presence challenged the simplistic American stereotypes and forced the camp authorities to grapple more directly with the complexities of holding female prisoners who were, by international law, protected non-combatants. Once the initial shock and interrogations subsided, life for the women at Camp McCoy settled into a monotonous routine. The days were long and structured, but largely empty. They were awakened by a bell, attended roll call, and ate their meals in a communal mess hall. The food itself was a source of constant wonder and occasional revulsion. They were served American fare: white bread, butter, milk, potatoes, a diet rich in calories but utterly alien to their palates. They craved rice and fish, the staples of their homeland. Unlike the male German and Italian POWs who were often put to work on local farms and in factories, the Japanese women were deemed too high a security risk, and too much of a political curiosity, to be allowed outside the compound. There was no meaningful work for them. To combat the crushing boredom, they organized their own activities. They tended a small vegetable garden, growing Japanese produce from seeds they had requested. They were given sewing materials and mended their clothes or created small handicrafts. They took English classes taught by WACs, Women's Army Corps, Guards. They played traditional Japanese games and sang songs from home. But beneath this veneer of structured activity lay a deep and gnawing uncertainty. They were suspended in time, disconnected from the war and from their families. The routine was a way to survive, a way to mark the passage of days, but every sunset was a reminder that they were prisoners, half a world away from home, with no end to their captivity in sight. The primary justification for bringing these women to America was intelligence gathering. The Military Intelligence Service, MIS, saw them as a potential source of information that was difficult to obtain from male soldiers, who were often highly indoctrinated and tight-lipped. The interrogators hoped the women, nurses and civilian workers, might have overheard conversations or possess knowledge about morale, food shortages, supply lines, and the psychological state of the Japanese soldier and civilian. The interrogations took place in small, nondescript rooms within the camp. They were long, patient affairs, often conducted by Nisei linguists who could navigate the subtle cultural and linguistic nuances. The results, however, were often disappointing for the Americans. Most of the women were not privy to high-level military secrets. A nurse could describe the types of wounds she treated, which might give some indication of the effectiveness of American weapons, but she was unlikely to know the strategic plans of the Imperial Army. A civilian clerk might know about local supply issues, but not about national industrial production. Furthermore, the women were deeply suspicious of their captors. They were torn between their duty to their country and the coercive pressure of their situation. Some provided small, useful tidbits of information. Others remained resolutely silent or claimed ignorance. The intelligence game at Camp McCoy was a slow, frustrating process, a high-stakes search for needles in a haystack that yielded far less than the military had hoped, yet it remained the central, defining purpose of the women's long and isolated confinement. Daily life in the compound was a constant, low-level cultural collision. The Japanese women were guarded by members of the Women's Army Corps, or WACs. These American servicewomen were often young, from small towns, and had as little experience with Japanese culture as the prisoners had with American ways. The interactions were a mixture of official duty, human curiosity, and profound misunderstanding. The WACs were instructed to be firm but fair, adhering to the Geneva Convention. But they were often baffled by their charges. They were struck by the Japanese women's emphasis on group harmony, their deference to authority figures like Chief Nurse Nibu, and their quiet, reserved demeanor, which was often misinterpreted as sullenness or deceit. The Japanese women, in turn, were shocked by the American women. They saw the WACs as loud, informal, and astonishingly independent. The way they smoked cigarettes, drove jeeps, and spoke to male officers with a casual familiarity was completely alien to the strict social hierarchies the Japanese women had been raised in. Yet, amidst the official distance, small moments of connection occurred. A shared laugh over a failed attempt at communication. A WAC guard showing a prisoner a picture of her family. A Japanese woman teaching a guard a few words of her language. These were fleeting instances of shared humanity in a situation designed to emphasize their differences. They were small cracks in the wall that separated captive from captor, offering a glimpse of the women on the other side of the wire. While America was engaged in a massive propaganda effort to demonize the Japanese and rally support for the war, the women of Camp McCoy remained a closely guarded secret. Their existence ran counter to the dominant narrative. It was one thing to show newsreels of surrendering male soldiers, proving the enemy was not invincible. It was another thing entirely to publicize the fact that the United States was holding women as prisoners of war. This could have been a public relations nightmare. It could have been twisted by Japanese propaganda to prove American brutality, potentially endangering American POWs held by Japan. It also complicated the purely racial and monstrous image of the enemy that was so useful for wartime morale. How do you square the image of a buck-toothed, inhuman fanatic with a photograph of a frightened young nurse? The government's solution was silence. The camp was a black site for these women. Their letters home were censored not just for military intelligence, but to remove any mention of their location or their status as prisoners in America. The local Wisconsin newspapers were forbidden from writing about them. They were, in effect, ghosts within the American prison system. This secrecy, intended to manage public perception and prevent diplomatic incidents, had a profound effect on the women themselves. It deepened their isolation, cutting them off not just from their families, but from the world itself. They were a footnote the government did not want read, a story no one was supposed to know. August, 1945. The rhythm of life at Camp McCoy was shattered by news from the outside world, delivered by the camp authorities. The news was stark, unbelievable, and world-altering. The Americans had dropped a new kind of bomb on a city called Hiroshima. A few days later, another on Nagasaki. For the women, these were not just abstract strategic victories. These were cities in their homeland, places where they might have friends or family. The scale of the destruction was incomprehensible. Then came the final, most seismic shock. The Emperor, their living god, had spoken over the radio and announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The war was over. For the prisoners, this news was met not with universal joy, but with a complex storm of emotions. There was relief, of course, the hope that their long ordeal was finally ending. But there was also profound grief for their defeated nation and deep anxiety for the safety of their families in a country now facing occupation. And above all, there was disbelief. The Japan they knew was a nation that would never surrender. The idea was a contradiction in terms. The emperor's broadcast, which they heard about secondhand, signaled the end of their entire worldview. The divine sun that had guided their empire had set, and they were left in the disorienting twilight, prisoners of a victorious enemy, wondering what would become of them and the country they no longer recognized. VJ Day did not mean immediate freedom. For the women at Camp McCoy, the end of the war simply marked the beginning of a new, agonizing period of waiting. The global logistics of demobilizing millions of soldiers and repatriating millions of prisoners and displaced persons was a monumental task. A small group of a few hundred Japanese prisoners in Wisconsin was a very low priority. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The routine of the camp continued, but now it was colored by a restless anticipation. The very reason for their imprisonment, intelligence, was now moot. They were no longer a source of information about a wartime enemy. They were a bureaucratic problem to be solved. During this time, the rules in the camp relaxed slightly. More Red Cross packages arrived. The tone of the guards softened. But the uncertainty was a psychological burden. They read censored news reports about the American occupation of Japan, about food shortages, about the destruction of their cities. They tried to imagine what they would be returning to. Would their homes still be standing? Were their families still alive? The waiting was, for some, harder than the certainty of their wartime captivity. It was a limbo, a state of suspended animation where the only thing to do was wait for a ship that was always promised but never seemed to arrive, a ship that would take them back to a home that might not exist anymore. Finally, in late 1945 and early 1946, the orders came. The women were to be sent home. They packed their few belongings, handicrafts made in the camp, worn-out clothing, and letters from the Red Cross. They were taken by train back to the West Coast, to Seattle or San Francisco, to board ships bound for Japan. The mood on this return voyage was vastly different from the fearful passage to America. The dread was replaced by a nervous, brittle hope. But as their ships drew closer to Japan, the reality of their country's fate became devastatingly clear. They sailed into harbors choked with the wreckage of sunken ships. They saw cities that were no longer cities, just flattened, scorched plains of rubble stretching to the horizon. This was not the Japan they had left. The proud, imperial nation was gone, replaced by a broken country occupied by foreign soldiers. Upon disembarking, they were processed by American occupation authorities, given a small amount of money and a train ticket, and then they were on their own. They stepped out of the port gates into a world of chaos, poverty, and starvation. The vibrant, orderly society they remembered had been replaced by a desperate struggle for survival. The homecoming they had dreamed of for years was, in reality, an arrival in a strange and terrifying new land. The greatest shock for the returning women was not the physical destruction, but the social and psychological reception they received. They expected to be welcomed home as fellow sufferers of the war. Instead, they were often met with suspicion, pity, or outright hostility. In the Japanese military culture of the time, surrender was the ultimate disgrace. To be captured alive was to have failed in one's duty. While these women were not all soldiers, the stigma of being a horyo, a prisoner of war, clung to them. Families were sometimes ashamed, neighbors whispered, potential employers were wary. There were dark rumors about what they must have done to survive in the hands of the enemy, rumors fueled by the years of anti-American propaganda. They were women who had been tainted by their contact with foreigners. Finding a husband was difficult, as they were no longer seen as pure or desirable. They had violated one of the most powerful social codes of their time. They had survived when they were expected to have died. To protect themselves and their families from this social poison, most of the women made a conscious choice. They would never speak of their time in America. They buried their experiences, hid their POW identification cards, and tried to blend back into a society that did not want to acknowledge their existence. Their story, already a secret in America, was now forced into silence in their own homeland. In the decades that followed, the women of Camp McCoy scattered across a recovering Japan. They did what millions of their countrymen did. They worked to rebuild their lives from the ashes. They found jobs, often in nursing or clerical work where their skills were needed. They married, raised children, and grew old. But they carried their secret with them. Their time in America became a locked room in their minds, a chapter of their lives they rarely, if ever, revisited. To their new families and friends, they were simply survivors of the war, like everyone else. They did not speak of the Wisconsin snow, of the strange American food, of the WWII guards, or of the long, tedious hours spent behind barbed wire. The trauma of their capture, the shame of their interrogation, and the stigma of their return conspired to enforce a lifetime of silence. This silence was a survival mechanism. In a society desperate to forget the humiliation of defeat and move forward into an uncertain future, there was no place for their complicated story. It fit neither the narrative of heroic sacrifice nor the narrative of victimhood. It was an anomaly, and so it was suppressed, not by government decree, but by a powerful, unspoken social contract. The women themselves became the guardians of their own forgotten history, protecting themselves by ensuring no one ever knew the full truth of what they had endured. For half a century, the story of the Japanese women POWs remained almost completely unknown. In Japan, it was shrouded in personal silence and national amnesia. In the United States, it was buried in bureaucracy. The records of their captivity, interrogation reports, camp rosters, medical files, and correspondence were classified during the war and then archived away. Deep in the vaults of the National Archives in Washington, D.C., they were just a handful of files among millions of documents from the largest war in history. No one was looking for them because no one knew to look. The grand narratives of World War II, the great battles, the famous generals, the political turning points, dominated historical inquiry. A story about a few hundred women in a secret compound in Wisconsin was a historical footnote at best, an insignificant detail in a global cataclysm. It took a new generation of historians, those willing to look beyond the official histories and dig into the margins, to even begin to uncover the tale. The story didn't exist in books. It existed only as faint whispers in declassified documents, as names on a shipping manifest, as cryptic references in the administrative history of a POW camp in the American Midwest. The silence was nearly absolute, and it was only by chance and an immense amount of scholarly detective work that the story was ever brought back into the light. Beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, researchers like historian Toshiyuki Tanaka began to piece together the puzzle. Using the newly accessible archival documents from the United States, they were able to identify the women and begin the painstaking process of trying to find them in Japan. It was a race against time. The women were in their 70s and 80s. Many had already passed away. Those who were found were often hesitant to speak, the habit of silence deeply ingrained after so many decades. But some, with gentle persistence, began to open up. For the first time, they shared their stories, not with interrogators or government officials, but with historians who genuinely wanted to understand their experience. They spoke of their fear during capture, their bewilderment in America, their relationships with the WWII guards, their longing for home, and the painful silence that followed their return. Their memories, sharp and vivid even after 50 years, filled in the human details that the official documents lacked. They provided the emotional heart of the story that had been missing for so long. The interviews, combined with the archival evidence, finally allowed for a full picture to emerge. A secret history, held in the memories of a few elderly women, was at last being recorded, ensuring that their unique and extraordinary journey would not be lost to time. The story of the Japanese women of Camp McCoy is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a powerful reminder of the hidden complexities of war. It challenges our comfortable, black and white narratives of good versus evil, and forces us to confront the humanity of those we label the enemy. These women were not fanatic soldiers or sinister spies. They were ordinary people swept up by the extraordinary violence of their time. Their experience as prisoners in the American heartland was a unique crucible, a microcosm of the cultural incomprehension that fueled the Pacific War. Their subsequent silence in Japan speaks volumes about the lingering wounds of conflict and the heavy burden of shame that is often placed upon survivors. Their story does not change the outcome of the Second World War. It does not alter the narrative of the great battles or the strategic decisions. But it enriches our understanding of the true cost of war, which is always paid by individuals. It reminds us that for every official report and every military history, there are 1,000 personal stories of fear, survival, and quiet resilience that go unheard. The faces of these women, once classified and forgotten, now re-emerge from the shadows, asking us to remember that in any conflict, the line between combatant and non-combatant, between guilt and innocence, is never as clear as we would like to believe.